You are listening to the Visualising War podcast. In each episode, we look at how people have experienced, described, or imagined war in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which representations of war and peace can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I co-direct the Visualising War project at the University of St Andrews. Over the next few months, we're going to be releasing a series of one-off podcast episodes connected to some new work we're doing on children's habits of visualising war and peace, and on the representation of war's aftermath, particularly the impacts of forced displacement, one of the many ripple effects of war, but also how we think and talk about conflict resolution and peace building. We wanted to begin with a war that's on everyone's minds right now, the devastating conflict in Ukraine. My guest today is Dr. Olga Boichak, a Ukrainian-born sociologist who works as a lecturer in digital cultures at the University of Sydney. Editor of the Digital War Journal, Olga's particular research interest is the war media nexus. She has spent years studying participatory warfare in Ukraine, looking at how civilians have used mobile media and open source intelligence to engage remotely in military conflict, and also at how digital media are facilitating grassroots activism, from local military crowdfunding to the development of transnational humanitarian aid networks. Her research helps us understand the symbiotic relationship between digital and real-world activities, not just how war and digital media shape each other, but how digitally driven volunteer movements that emerge in wartime can have longer-term effects on civil society development and broader institutional change. Her wide range of publications examine volunteering, transnational mobilization, and diasporic humanitarianism surrounding the Russian-Ukrainian war. And she also writes more broadly about the evolution of networks, narratives, and cultures of activism in the digital age. So, Olga, thank you so much for making time to talk to me today. I've got lots to ask you about civilian participation in conflict, about the role that digital media can play in that. But first of all, I want to acknowledge how difficult a topic this is for you to talk about right now, given all that's been happening in Ukraine over the last few weeks. Not only is your research rooted there, but you have many family members living in Ukraine, some of whom have been displaced by the war, some who are fighting, grandparents who are not able to leave their home. So I can only begin to imagine how upsetting and worrying things have been. And I'm really grateful that you're taking time to talk to us about it today. I wonder if you can begin just by telling us a little bit about what's been happening to the people you love, to your family over the last few weeks.
Hello, Alice. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a great pleasure and honor. I've been following your projects, and it's really a great pleasure to be here. So yes, like you said, it's been a really difficult 2 months for me, partially because as a Ukrainian, I still have a lot of family and friends in Ukraine, and their experiences have been really diverse. There's been a lot happening there, but also because in my research, I study that connection between the personal, the everyday, and the geopolitical. And so as it happens, I am now living through this time when really my personal does unfold into and inform the ways that I see my research and also the ways that I'm witnessing geopolitics kind of unfold in the place where I'm from. There's been a diversity of experiences that I've encountered from my friends and family. What really strikes me and what I can notice, and something that I've been really fascinated with, is this idea of productive resistance, is the fact that resistance can be seen not only as an act to obfuscate, to prevent something, which is what we traditionally think of when we talk about resistance, but really as the creation of new artifacts, new narratives, new vocabularies that emerge against the backdrop of this war and that actually are productive in ways that they are building something, they're creating something new. And these new things, they may be artifacts. We can see people coming together as networks, as communities. We can see them creating new civic vocabularies through which we can process this war. And that is something that I'm really interested in, and that's something that I'm very passionate about. So it's been amazing to watch these processes unfold from afar, but also very close.
Yes, as you say, that sort of intertwining of your personal life and your research coming together there. I'm really fascinated by what you say about this productive resistance and the way in which new things, new narratives, new artifacts are being created. You mentioned new civic vocabularies. Could you give us an example or two of that?
Yes, absolutely. So this is something that I've started to look at since 2014, and even earlier, since the Revolution of Dignity, which was, I guess, the first moment in Ukraine's history, which was a newly independent state over 2.5 decades at the time. It's a very old nation, but it was a relatively young democracy. And so what happened in 2013 during the Revolution of Dignity is that it was the first time in history when a lot of Ukrainians from different backgrounds really got together in this space or place that's called Maidan, which is a public square, or even we can trace it back to the Greek ideas of the forum, right, of a public space where deliberation happens, and really stood side by side. Prior to that, Ukraine really wasn't integrated. There was a very strong center, and then there was the periphery. And it so happened that many people living in those different places in Ukraine rarely interacted with others living in other places, except for sometimes going to the capital. So during Maidan, it was the first time when Ukraine was able to come together and really deliberate and reflect on the values that they held as Ukrainian citizens. And these weren't ethno-nationalist values. Those weren't identities that were connected to people's ethnicity. We saw people speaking Ukrainian and Russian standing side by side, really having the same democratic aspirations and seeing their role in creating history at that moment. And so that was the first big push towards the emergence of, I guess, civil society, but in a very Ukrainian sense. And that is since then, that is something that I've been studying. That's something that has fascinated me, because looking at it from the Western perspective, one would not necessarily recognize these processes as ones that are forming civil society. And so looking at the very traditional metrics of civil society, memberships, budget of organizations, things like that, it really is very easy to miss or to dismiss the forms of community, of coming together that we observed happened at the backdrop of this revolution, and that then were solidified with Russia's illegitimate actions that followed. So in 2014, then the illegal annexation of Crimea happened. Then the Russian orchestrated insurgencies in the east of Ukraine. And at that time, we see people really thinking very hard and acting with certain values and with certain aspirations in mind. And these values really indicated that they were articulating very active notions of citizenship. They saw themselves as agents in their own country. This is something relatively new. It took really 2.5 decades for these processes to start happening, but also this was qualitatively different from the kind of enduring Soviet legacy that really lingered throughout the early years of Ukraine's independence, is that people finally saw themselves as subjects, as agents, and were really constructing active imaginaries of their state.
Really fascinating. And as you say, that's the productive nature of this resistance, this revolution, this political movement, and the integration and the coming together and the growth, the sort of the organic growth of shared values and a sense of civic collective agency as well as individual agency. As you say, the current war in Ukraine then has roots that go a very long way back, not just to the Maidan Revolution, to Russia's annexation of Crimea, the conflict in the Donbass in 2014, but much earlier than that. There's a very long history of violent Russian imperialism that has taken many different forms in Ukraine over the decades. Your research obviously examines hybrid forms of war, hybrid forms of resistance as well. And you've drawn particular attention to some of the less visible tools of conflict, as well as the less visible tools of resistance that we've just been talking about. So by less visible tools, things like disinformation, cyber warfare. And you and others have written about the reflexive control that Russia has long been trying to exercise in Ukraine ever since Ukrainian independence in 1991. I wonder if you can explain to our listeners a bit more about what reflexive control is and what role it can play in developing conflicts. And then we'll come back more to this productive resistance that we've begun talking about.
Yes, absolutely. So the doctrine of reflexive control is actually pretty old. It also goes by the name of maskirovka, which is camouflage in Russian, and it's a kind of a classical Russian warfare doctrine. The key of this doctrine is altering the information environments in which the adversary is trying to make decisions. So there's a number of steps, a number of approaches But I really like the work of Larissa Doroshenko and Josephine Lukito, that this is a very new study that has come out where they really identified, defined, narrowed down those things that were part of the reflexive control by Russia. And there's four main elements. So dismiss, distort, distract, and dismay. Dismissing, it's a way of presenting evidence or adding different evidence to undermine the objectives of the adversary or deny the presented evidence. And we could see that very clearly in this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because the military buildup was there. It was amazing to me at the time, and it still amazes me to this day how so many intellectuals, military analysts have completely dismissed the very real threat of Russia's full-scale military attack because there was a lot of other conflicting information. And so that is a very significant strategy that was deployed by Russia that was very visible. They have done it before. And as you said, Alice, from the beginning of Ukraine's independence, Russia really has been perpetrating these various acts of covert and overt in order to keep Ukraine in its orbit of influence. And so what happened with the Revolution of Dignity is that Ukraine had two revolutions. One was in 2004, which was also the first attempt to dispute the rigged election that was rigged on Russia's part, where Russia was trying to install a pro-Russian president. So Ukrainians have resisted this reflexive control for decades, really. There were high-profile political assassinations at key moments in Ukrainian history that could be linked back to Russia. And so every time there was an attempt for self-governance, for some certain emergence of political subjectivity, of cultural subjectivity, of a distinct Ukrainian identity that actually has its very deep roots, kind of the resurgence, you can even say something like renaissance of the Ukrainian culture that had been oppressed in the Soviet times. Russia had always tried to counteract those and to create information environments in which those developments would be stalled. And so dismissing is one, then distortion is kind of attempts to alter one's perception of reality by presenting falsehoods. We could see that with Russia's President Vladimir Putin repeatedly denying their intervention in the east of Ukraine. They were claiming that people who were fighting in the east of Ukraine were just some pro-Russian separatists, whereas in fact, we now know the truth that those were regular Russian army soldiers. So this kind of distortion of the events that are taking place is also one of the principles of reflexive control. Then there's distraction, and we saw that happen again many times. One very interesting example was the protest by Marina Ovsyannikova, a Channel 1 producer, where she was parading with a poster that says "No to war, you're being lied to" on live television in Russia. And she got hailed as a hero, as a kind of dissident from the Russian power, whereas in fact, that was a really apt act of Russian propaganda to distract what was happening in Mariupol at the time, what was happening in cities around Kyiv. So the information cycle was really able to capture the viewer's attention with different things with that protest. Now we know that Marina Ovsyannikova was successfully employed by a German news outlet, Die Welt, where she is now continuing. She was a key person that was designing Russian propaganda throughout all the years of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And now we can see her getting a platform in a very reputable European news source to continue doing so. The same, we saw the tactics of Russian distraction with every time there have been the mock negotiations where Russia would say that they would like to negotiate. We saw in Turkey, that was another attempt to provide a platform for Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to just continue sharing their version of the reality. And that at the time when Russia's media were sanctioned, that was a really successful tactic to continue pushing that narrative. And finally, there's dismay. So dismay just dramatically escalates the situation to discourage an opponent from taking any action. And we could also see that as well with the demonstrations of Russia's military might in ways to kind of beat Ukraine into submission before the war even began. And so all of these things, sometimes they pick and choose, sometimes they work in a combination, but overall, this is kind of the gist. What's really fascinating about it, it's that it's really hard to call it out. It's really hard to deny it. We saw some really successful attempts to preempt what the Russians are going to be doing. We saw those attempts on part of the US intelligence, which was a new tactic in countering this reflexive control. But otherwise, it's really difficult because if the information environment, there's a lot of noise, it's really hard to find that signal. It's really hard to argue. As Peter Pomerantsev, who's a writer, says, nothing is true and then everything is possible. And so in this information environment, this is the environment in which Russia operates and in which it continues to operate with regard to Ukraine, but also other countries.
Thanks. That's an incredibly clear overview of this very Machiavellian tool of warfare, the full use of many different aspects of the information space to manipulate perceptions, but also to manipulate emotions as well, and doing so on many different fronts. And as you've sketched this, we can see clear examples of this during the current full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but it's been going on for a very long time. Similarly, though, the productive resistance to it has been going on for some time. You mentioned new US tactics, but there have been all sorts of ways of countering this that have been developed actually much more on the ground, much more in smaller micro ways, not just these sort of macro high level political responses. And I wonder if you could talk us through that a little bit. It'd be good just to hear a little bit about the sort of the longer term citizen response, civic response to Russian aggression, Russian manipulation.
Ukraine has a rich history of resistance and of insurgencies. And so we know that at the backdrop of the First World War and the Second World War, Ukrainians have had networks of civilian resistance. So this is also historically what we're seeing today is not new. In 2014, however, there have been new genres and new repertoires of this grassroots civilian resistance that have developed since Russia's annexation of Crimea, since the war in Donbass. And so what we're seeing today, really, because they've been pretty much hidden, and that is one of the reasons why I started studying those grassroots networks, because I saw so many stories that I felt like needed to be told. And I saw so many connections between what people were doing in their everyday life and really the geopolitical outcomes. So many people on the ground doing everything that they can to challenge Russia's dominance, to prevent further occupation of their country. And so what we saw in February and in March of 2022, it really was the expansion of scale of these activities dramatically by many orders of magnitude, but it wasn't really an expansion of scope. And so this scope of the things that people are doing to prevent occupation really has been in place since 2014, which really explains why they've been so sophisticated. And we can talk about this from the standpoint of participatory warfare, right? This radical openness of those systems, which allow people to really engage in that productive resistance. So it's a combination of digital and physical tools where people just use those features of their environment. And sometimes it would be really radical ways to resist occupation. So one of my favorite examples of it is the camouflage netting communities, which are essentially communities of craftivists, which are using scraps of camouflage. So this is pretty much the stuff that would otherwise get recycled. And they weave camouflage networks, masking networks, to shield Ukraine from above. So they're making their soldiers, the different artifacts, military objects, invisible from macroscopic surveillance. But at the same time, by coming together, by weaving those networks, there's really been a reclamation of public spaces in which people are engaged. There's a lot of people who are on the margins of the society, for example, who are living in poverty or living with a life-limiting condition, who are retired and looking for company. And so there's been a really a coming together of many people from all walks of life to make those networks. And so they're crafting a large scale and macroscopic military object, but at the same time, their resistance is essentially peaceful, right? They're really using their hands to produce those artifacts. This particular example really unsettles the definition between war and peace, right? What does anti-war resistance means? And so in that context, I reflected on the role that militarisms play in the Ukrainian society. Because really what we've seen in the literature, which is again very Western-centric literature on largely having to do with American imperialism, with British imperialism, is we saw that militarism is considered a negative phenomenon, and rightfully so. And there's a lot of negative consequences of militarism, including profound psychological consequences for people who are engaging in it. But in the Ukrainian case, this militarism, this organization for these craftivist communities were really counter-hegemonic, if you will. They were trying to resist an imperial power. And so in a way, I saw this as a decolonial movement, as a movement to put together, to put in place, to weave that social fabric as well as that camouflage fabric, to just come together as a community and create those solidarities that perhaps got ruined in the Soviet times. Perhaps the social trust, the sense of I don't like the use of social capital, so perhaps we can just talk about social network, social trust, communities that are, again, coming together with a goal, with a common goal, which are nonviolent. And so there's a lot of different ways of civilian resistance. There's very interesting work that's being done with civil aviation and drones, and how civilians are crowdfunding for those drones and then using them for reconnaissance purposes and cooperating with the Ukraine's military in providing them that key information. We know of the famous story of also resisting the Russian drones. One of the greatest stories of all, wartime stories of all time, was the woman who was standing on her balcony and who used a jar of pickles, were actually pickled tomatoes, to disable an enemy's drone. And that was her first encounter with a drone. And she pretty much used what she had at hand. But that kind of illustrates this idea of civilian resistance, as in just fighting with every means possible, including with canned tomatoes, so it's interesting to think of weaponization of different things that we can see in the wartime, and just different ways in which civilians can join the war effort. What's really interesting is that they're not joining this effort only on part of the Ukrainian state. So this is not the state itself that's militarizing, which is happening. There's a lot of militarization that's organized by the state, but also people join this resistance and they bring different values into it, and they're not necessarily state-centric. So that is interesting, really, the diversity of values and motivations with which people join these movements.
Mm-hmm. You know, this weaponization of ordinary objects and this blurring of boundaries between peaceful activities and resistance and wartime activities, of course, is something that's happened in many conflicts. But the story that you're sketching here is that something very, very particular has grown organically from the roots, from the ground up, sort of very grassroots activities, partly because of the long history of Russia wanting to keep Ukraine in its orbit post-independence, and then things being triggered in 2004, but then 2014, and this very long, slow build-up that's been invisible to the wider world, but has been going on and growing all this time. Of course, not all past wars. I mean, you mentioned that some of this, goes back to World War I, World War II, but it's only in recent years that the digital space has become a real facilitator of some of this. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about this. So you've written a lot about these grassroots responses to reflexive control, and you've looked a little bit at how grounded they have been in increased digital literacy and social media networking. So, for example, in an article for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, you've written, following the annexation of Crimea, Russia repeated the same scenario in other eastern Ukrainian cities. In response, citizens of Mariupol, the next strategic object of Russian interest on the map, took to social media to preemptively identify and mitigate the diffused and otherwise inconspicuous security threats in their city. Thousands of Mariupol civilians spent their days and nights collecting and verifying intelligence from local social media posts and informants, and fighting the spread of false and misleading information about events in their city. This civilian effort became part of a coordinated response with local security services and the state military. Now, that's back in 2014. And I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit more about that, but also what we can learn from it about warfare in the digital age.
Yes, absolutely. Mariupol is a fascinating case, and what we're seeing happen with Mariupol now is really tragic, and it is perhaps a very high price that Mariupol is paying for having resisted Russian occupation for so long, so successfully. And unfortunately, this is true, and unfortunately, many of us were calling to the fact that if Russia invades Ukraine, Mariupol is going to be the next target. We were being called delusional by some. I guess every digital war scholar or war military scholar was hoping that this will never come true, right? These are some of the prognoses that we desperately want to not happen. We want to be wrong. We want to be proved wrong. And that, I guess, is one of the reasons why many of us weren't really as active and as insistent on the fact that this threat was very real when it was just kind of gathering in the beginning of 2022. But really what we saw in Mariupol was something amazing. And this is where the citizens of Mariupol were using these affordances of social media, two affordances, affordance of publicness, while at the same time, the affordance of anonymity. So those two things, they very aptly used to combat this quote unquote non-occupation of their city. So because of social media, because people were increasingly getting themselves Facebook accounts, and this was unfolding largely over Facebook at the time, they could identify those patterns of Russian interference in other cities, and they could communicate with people from different cities. They could see that, kind of like we saw in Crimea, the annexation of Crimea is amazing on its own because social media was integral in arbitrating this distinction between war and non-military activities. And so when we saw the annexation of Crimea, not a single shot was fired, everything was peaceful, there were smiling men in unmarked uniforms with no insignia that just silently took over key government buildings and institutions, and that was it. So it's really interesting how the world kind of missed this annexation. This was the most significant land grab since World War II in Europe, and it just came unnoticed exactly because the evidence, the photographs, the narratives from the place did not suggest anything closely related to war. And so that was the tactic, and that was something that then happened in Donetsk and Luhansk. And these are really large urban metropolitan areas where it was easier to do it. Mariupol had the advantage of having been smaller. It's only a 500,000 population city. So when people in Mariupol started noticing strangers, those so-called political tourists arriving in their cities, there were young men who were shipped into Mariupol by buses. There were just busloads of these fake protesters coming in, trying to recruit local population to work with them, trying to protest, to create protests where they would say that they would like to join Russia, things like that. In Mariupol, there weren't any pro-Russian sentiments at the time. People also weren't politically active, that is very true. So they didn't really exhibit any distinct political convictions. But at the same time, nobody ever discussed wanting to join Russia. And this is something that people who actually had access to survey instruments, survey data really knew about their city, that there was no pro-Russian sentiment in a sense that let's separate from Ukraine and join Russia. And so the main work of these activists was to deliver public information to people in the city. That again goes back to the question of visibility and how we perceive our reality based on what's visible, what's not. When the whole city is covered in Russian symbols, when there's people protesting to join Russia, it's very easy to believe that the city wants to join Russia. And that was, of course, done for the optics. That was a really great look for the Russian state media, and that was really used in that sense. And that is why for the following 8 years, pretty much until 2022, as Ukrainian researchers, we were actually required, even in the papers that we were writing, to write Russian-backed separatists, because that was the kind of common knowledge and that was the accepted version of reality that was accepted largely by the West. So that seemed to be the consensus. So the extent to which this reflexive control worked, making it seem to this very day, there's still a lot of people who are saying, oh, but these are Russian speaking people. And so kind of conflating that the speaking Russian with a pro-Russian identity, with the willingness to actually live in Russia, to be part of Russia. So it's been really effective in that sense. And so that is what a handful of activists in Mariupol really tried to disprove. And by 2015, they had thousands and thousands of people marching on Ukraine's Independence Day in August with Ukrainian flags, really demonstrating their political will. And we saw that. So this was really inspiring, and that actually allowed to liberate Mariupol. It was occupied for just 3 months. There was a special military operation. But we also saw how Russian state media, how much effort they put to delegitimize those who defended Mariupol. So we know the legendary Azov regiment, which has become a household name. And it's amazing because there are so many right-wing regiments in Russia and communities that are actually, and I've been studying these, so it's unbelievable. For example, there would be a group of Stalin readings or Stalin appreciation or things like that are actually distinctly right-wing. Whereas the Azov regiment, there were maybe a few people who could exhibit some ultra-conservative or ultra-nationalist views that kind of became this bit of a scarecrow. And what's interesting that I actually communicated with an Australian journalist, Bryce Wilson, who was embedded with the Azov regiment, who's the only Western journalist who was embedded with that regiment. And he disproves the fact that they're the right wing, that they have any connections to Nazi. So Russia really did so much to delegitimize these efforts to prevent this occupation. But unfortunately, the Western news outlets have repeated these narratives, and a lot of these narratives that were kind of initially seeded by Russia were perpetuated by Western media, not checked, not fact-checked. And unfortunately, this is what we've come to know. So every time I would give a talk on Ukraine, there would be that one Azov regiment question. To this day, Russia is using it as a justification, for example, for bombing the maternity hospital in Mariupol. They would say, oh, but the Azov battalion was there. And that seems to exonerate what they've been trying to do, even though it was very clearly a civilian object. That's the main thing, that the activists in Mariupol were able to achieve something that then was replicated in other Ukrainian cities, in Kharkiv, in Dnipro, the kind of next objects of Russian strategic interest. So when we're being asked, oh, why did Putin not capture all of Ukraine back in 2014? He might have liked to, but there were these grassroots networks of civilian resistance that really have actively prevented him. And in 2022, we also saw that these protests with very visible Ukrainian national symbols were also a tool of resisting, of peaceful resistance. We saw them even happen in the areas that are currently occupied by Russia. We see this in Kherson. We see this in Berdyansk, in Melitopol, because this works actively to kind of disrupt the Russian narrative about Ukrainians being a non-entity or Ukrainians being pro-Russian. And so Mariupol was really kind of at the forefront. They were really amazing in how they coordinated, how they were able to organize.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, Mariupol has taken such a terrible hit in this conflict. It's not an accident, partly because of this story that you've been telling. It's a story that is deeply worrying on many levels, insofar as the power to distort, the manipulation, the leveraging of social media tools, the weaponization of social media to promote optics, which the wider media, traditional media organizations, rather unthinkingly or uncritically accept. That ability of governments, bad actors, all sorts of different people to leverage social media as a tool of warfare. But there's also a very strong positive element to the story you've been telling, which is this handful of activists who found ways of coordinating, critiquing, questioning, challenging those widely circulating narratives and those widely circulating images. That's an incredible sort of David and Goliath kind of story, insofar as it's a sort of small number of people working against huge mechanisms and organizations. So, Olga, you've given us a really strong picture there of a handful of activists in a small city in Ukraine working away to counter these imposed narratives. But of course, social media and digital networks have been used to facilitate transnational forms of activism as well, not just activism on the ground locally. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that, about the way in which over the last 10 years or so, but particularly actually in 2022, social media and digital networks have been allowing people far away to participate remotely in what we might call the war effort, crowdfunding for the Ukrainian military, for example, but also humanitarian support, with diasporas engaging in this conflict that's both near and far to them.
Yes, absolutely. This is something that I find really fascinating. And as we can look at it through the prism of media studies and looking at Marshall McLuhan's work, I know it's a very kind of classical canon, but the way that he theorizes the changes in social phenomena, the media-driven changes, whether media can change the scale of something, the scope of something, or the pace of something. And we've definitely seen these three parameters changing in how humanitarianism is being conducted. And so one very bright story that I usually use to illustrate why this matters is a story of a 10-year-old boy. And this is something that came across in my newsfeed back in 2015, and it was shared really as a kind of a feel-good story. But to me, that was a very profound illustration of those networks. And so it was a 10-year-old boy who was an American of Ukrainian descent. and who ran a birthday fundraiser for his 10th birthday to purchase a sports utility vehicle for the Ukrainian army. And so there's two photographs in the press. In one, he's holding this handful of birthday cash. In the second one, there is a soldier standing next to an SUV with a cardboard with a large thank you note. And that SUV bears the name of that benefactor. I remember I talked to my son, who was 10 at the time, and I said, look, this guy has just deployed an SUV at an active military battlefront. And my son said, yeah, that's really cool. I do that in the world of tanks. That's like normal. And so to me, this idea that, wow, digitally, it's an easy thing to do. And again, we have a lot of apps, right? We click on the picture of food and then Grubhub comes and delivers it. And so there's a lot of hidden infrastructure behind these seemingly sleek acts, and humanitarianism is also one of them. So getting to the bottom of the social infrastructure that actually made it possible, it probably took over 30 people, a concerted effort to actually transform that birthday cash into that SUV. It took so many links in so many countries, people just working together to make it happen. They're really fast. And so this is something that really fascinates me with looking at digital media. And I've studied diasporic communications in different countries around the world, looking at how they use those social media affordances to generate this humanitarian aid. And I do think that there's a lot more research to be done. What I'm seeing is that these networks are kind of becoming more horizontal, if you will. So the pace is definitely faster. So diasporas have been always active, and Ukrainian diaspora in particular, again, has a rich history of helping Ukrainians in different crises. But that history was mostly of lobbying their host governments. And we can see that very clearly now. So it's also interesting that hybridity, how kind of older repertoires of collective action coexist with the newer ones, kind of like the older media coexist with the newer ones. And we're seeing the resurgence of radio or of audio, right? With even looking at this podcast and how those many different older media kind of got incorporated in these hybrid media environments. And so the same is what's happening with humanitarianism. There's a lot of digital tools that are being used, including digital petitions, things like that, to petition the host country governments to provide humanitarian aid. I'm very fortunate to be in Australia, where there's really a lot of communities working in concert to assure that the Australian government provides military aid, humanitarian aid to Ukraine. And it's been amazing to observe that. But there's also networks that are working directly. And so social media really makes it very easy and very transparent in a way, because these networks are using social media also for reporting, for accountability. There's many, many smaller networks that do very targeted, specific help. And that is usually the help we saw a bit. It was a crisis of international humanitarianism, what we saw in Ukraine. We saw the scandal with the International Red Cross. We saw the fact that they were unable to get into the hotspots where people needed help the most. And at the same time, we saw those very private initiatives, people just driving their cars, quietly bringing in food, supplies, medicines to those who needed them the most. So this agility and this kind of very fast pace at which these volunteers are able to work and are able to provide the aid is really something that we saw in this conflict as well, in this war that has been ongoing for the past 8 years in these networks. It's really interesting. There's amazing research done by Olga Boichak, who's looking at whether these are really social media or more social networks. And so that's what's fascinating about this concept of social infrastructures, is that it's not just people who are strangers and met on social media, and it's not just traditional community networks. It's kind of a hybrid of both. It's people really using social media to expand the scale, the scope of what they're doing, to affect the timing. And it's really interesting because that's what I ask people who I did my interviews with. That was the first thing that I asked them. What would you be doing in the absence of social media? And there are so many options. They're so creative, agile. They're switching between different communication channels and modes of communicating. And really, there are so many forms in which they're doing their work.
The word hybrid cuts across so many of the things that we've been talking about in this conversation so far, and so many aspects of your research. So we've talked about the power of digital social media purely to generate ideas that actually are part of an information war and to counter those ideas. But what you've just been sketching there is this real intersection between the social social interactions, social media, digital media, the physical and the digital ideas and artifacts, all of those coming together. Talking about hybridity and blurred boundaries and so on, we're thinking about the blurred boundaries between near and far, where people in communities in Australia and to America and all around the world are able to engage actually really quite directly. But blurred boundaries between private and public, between civilian and military, between wartime and peacetime. We're touching on all of those hybridities. As you've put it in an article you've written, crowdfunding brings internet users into the intimate proximity to the conflict. It unsettles the boundary between the military logistics and civilian logistics. And this I think maybe gets us actually into some ethical questions and some ethical space. What implications do you think this blurring of boundaries have for individuals and societies? What are the risks? What are the advantages? You told a story of a 10-year-old boy for his birthday, crowdfunding effectively for some military equipment. I'm very conscious of the fact that there are many people 8 weeks into the full-scale invasion of Ukraine who prior to that would never have contemplated supplying arms to a state or an organization or even an individual, but who are now crossing those lines and contributing to military crowdfunding, not just humanitarian crowdfunding. So it'd just be interesting to know a little bit about what you think are the risks as well as the advantages of this blurring of boundaries there.
Yes, I'm finding that blurring of boundaries fascinating. And it's really because when the war in Ukraine started back in 2014, everybody was talking about how this war is hybrid. And the only way in which, the most kind of widespread connotation of that term, we were talking about how it was disinformation. So it was information warfare and it was the boots on the ground. And so that was kind of this physical digital distinction / divide was kind of the center of our discussions about why this warfare is hybrid. However, as you noted, Alice, there's so many other ways in which this hybridity manifests itself, and it's this hybridity between the public and the private, between the military and the civilian, between weapons and witnesses. And so there's many of these hybridities that really unsettle our understanding of military conflicts. And that is also one of the motivations that have brought me into this scholarly space, is really trying to make sense, because what I was seeing on the ground was really incredibly difficult to theorize using the frameworks that I was familiar with. The most fascinating thing for me was the military-civilian cooperation, right? I could see those grassroots networks as being civilians, and then there's the military, and then they're cooperating really on a very horizontal level, bringing stuff to the soldiers that they need to really make sure that those soldiers survive and are able to continue defending the shifting kind of battlefront and defending Ukraine's border. But that was not a thing. And so I'm really grateful to those scholars of military-civilian relations who have sat me down and told me that, really pointed out that what you're describing has military and has civilians in it, but that's not what we mean by the military-civilian relations. And so that had suggested that maybe there's a lot of value, a lot of benefit in trying to tell those stories and analyze them and really try to maybe unsettle some of those very set in stone distinctions. And as you said, to many people prior to February 2022, if I were to suggest that somebody would invest in heavy weapons to send to Ukraine, or someone would support the purchase of ammunition, for many people that would have been morally unacceptable. However, also what's significant about the Ukrainian conflict is that it is unprecedented in ways. And so a lot of those distinctions that we operate on perhaps would benefit from revising, because what's happening there at the scale that it's happening now, it really hasn't happened for a long while. And so I feel like we're lacking definitions and processes of changing the situation there. And so as we're seeing with many international organizations, because their procedures are so historically firm, it's really difficult to act fast in an environment that requires it. And so I feel like in this context, in this environment, it's really not possible to stay neutral. We can try to be objective to the extent that we can, but we cannot be neutral. And so I guess that's where the ethics come in, is the ethics of not being complicit with what's happening, and the goal to do something to prevent those senseless civilian deaths. And so that's what unsettles the distinction between war and peace, because it's, in a way, it's even counterintuitive, supplying heavy weapons to Ukraine to prevent war. But that is what we have today, and we're seeing that there's new developments with Transnistria. We saw those survey, which were problematic, but nonetheless, they indicate that there are next countries on the list that Russians are contemplating for attacking, and those countries actually know it. So this is a very significant threat. This is a very real threat. This is something that, unfortunately, it needs to shift. And this is, again, where militarisms come in, and which is where we've been trained, and it's so deeply ingrained in us that this is bad, that we should be preventing it. But then again, we can also reconsider the meaning of militarism in a situation like this, where it is pretty much, it's existential. It's the whole identity, the whole people who is being threatened, and for whom militarism is kind of their last resort in defending themselves. And so it's really interesting. We can see the weaponization of identity by how Ukrainians are using their Ukrainian identity as really this driving force to counteract how they're creating these new values, new norms of civicness to really define themselves as a nation. And so hopefully these processes will get to develop. Of course, this is not unproblematic, and understanding that having this many weapons in Ukraine will likely need, but this would be an issue for a later time, I guess. But right now, that's the main thing that we should be doing, is supplying Ukraine with military and humanitarian aid, and hoping that they are able to withstand this threat.
Yeah, again, there's so much to unpack in what you've just said there. And you've raised really important points, which I hope we'll come back to in a minute, about the artificial distinctions in some ways between military and civilian, but also between war and peace. And the idea that, in fact, maybe we need to be thinking more of a spectrum than a binary. That's true of many, many conflicts, but it's just become increasingly visible of the Ukrainian conflict, partly because of the levels of local, but also national and international engagement stroke participation in that. And you're absolutely right, this need for new definitions, or at least the kind of questioning, the challenging of definitions and positions, is something that's becoming really stark. So I'm thinking, for example, right now of a powerful article by a Ukrainian postdoctoral researcher at St Andrews called Daria Symbiotic, and also a colleague of hers called Irina Zamurieva. Both of them are feminists. Both have been heavily critical of militarization in the past, in particular of the military industrial complex and the international weapons market, which of course at the moment is flourishing. But they've written the following: Russia's war against our homeland, Ukraine, has forced us into a situation where we believe the only ethical choice for us as feminists is to lobby for more air defense systems for our country. Calling for military support has not come as an easy decision for us, yet at this point, a pacifist stance perpetuates ongoing violence. Pacifism kills, inaction kills. Each day of this war means more and more lives are lost, and not only human lives, but also lives of other species, with whole ecosystems ruptured and attacked. And they go on to stress, there's no neat blueprint for practicing ethical politics, but at this moment, non-military aid is not enough. In the case of Ukraine now, it's not an abstract ethical question of supporting militarization, it's a question of life and death, of allowing people on the ground to defend themselves and to defend civilians from constant shelling by Russia. And they come back to their feminism, which, as I say, in the past has aligned with very strong anti-militarization arguments. And they write, our understanding of feminism is an active intersectional struggle to dismantle all kinds of oppression. Our understanding of feminism is about helping the oppressed to survive. The war in Ukraine presents us with a particular kind of oppression. Russian imperialism poses an existential threat to our homeland. For us, dismantling Russian oppression starts with the resistance. They go through these reflections on how their positionality, how their identity has shifted. And I think that really reflects some of the things that you've been saying about not all militarisms are the same, this questioning of definitions, this questioning of identity.
I do think that positions of power from which we write as academics, the positions from which we exist in the world, really significantly affect our understanding of this war and our understanding about what is to be done. And I guess when we talk about, reflecting on, for example, Cynthia Enlow's work and militarizing maneuvers, right, that kind of ruin solidarities among people, that kind of stratify the society, we're seeing people in Ukraine actually unite and kind of craft those solidarities anew with people whose identities have been traditionally either excluded from the public discourse or who have been made invisible, who haven't been considered significant. And so we're actually seeing the opposite happening, that because of these militarizing maneuvers, we're seeing the society come together in ways. And so that was my main counter argument to why militarisms can be seen as something negative. But also, in a way, it's a crisis of how we're used to see the world. It's almost a crisis of epistemology, in that what we mean by militarization might not incorporate some of those phenomena that we're seeing in Ukraine on the ground. And a lot of the times, as a Ukrainian scholar, it has been really difficult for me to see some of the very high level discussions of this conflict, saying that Ukraine is only a buffer zone, that it's kind of a power struggle between Russia and the West, because all of these conversations, and this has been happening for years, I mean, ever since Ukraine's independence, and probably many scholars who are situated or who are speaking and writing from those contexts of the developing democracies can relate to that, to kind of being viewed by Western scholars as that kind of deprived of their agency in a way. And so that is something that I'm thankfully seeing the resurgence of, is what I'm seeing more Ukrainian scholars being invited into these spaces, and at least being provided a platform to really represent what people in Ukraine are feeling and writing and seeing. And that, again, social media is really important in these spaces, because we can bear witness to the processes that are happening in our homelands. We can help amplify the voices of others. So hopefully this will add a body of literature. There's really, Tanya Lokoch, who's at Dublin City University, and I have recently written a piece on the role of diasporas and really transnational activists in translating the things that are happening in our homelands to the Western audience in ways that is comprehensible, in ways that make sense. And so it's a very important work that a lot of diasporas, and not only diasporas, but a lot of, I guess, scholars who have different positions of power are bringing into the academic discourse, is really this ability to translate what we're seeing. And sometimes the radical inability to translate what we're seeing on the ground into the kind of more conceptually legible forms that we think of when we think of war.
Those conceptually legible forms, that comes back to the point you just made, that great phrase, the crisis of how we see the world, but also the question of who we hear in the world. And as you've just sketched, that is actually changing somewhat, has changed particularly since February 2022, when people did start to want to listen much more to Ukrainian voices rather than accepting sort of more outside externalized narratives. And it really brings us back to narrative itself, and the power of storytelling actually in reflexive control, but also in resistance, and the impact of storytelling on how we visualize the world, how we understand the world, and therefore how we act in it. And I've been struck quite a lot over the last few weeks by parallel trends in the storytelling around the invasion of Ukraine. So in some ways, my social media feed, and I suppose this is true for many others, has taken me back to very much more recognizable conventional images of war. My social media feeds are full of tanks, full of bombed cities, full of the terrible destruction of artillery, and full of lots of people talking about war in those terms and with those technologies at the forefront. But your research reminds us to look much more closely at the less visible aspects of contemporary 21st century warfare, at these blurred boundaries between civilian and military organizations and collectives and movements, and to understand that however much what we're seeing in our social media feeds might resemble images we're familiar with from the 20th century, contemporary conflicts are operating in multiple spheres, and as we've said, a hybrid in multiple ways. So that really just does bring us back to this question of how our traditional habits of visualizing war are being at once reinforced actually by some of the media coverage of the current conflict, but also being radically disrupted. And I'd just like to hear a little bit more from you about how you think our conceptions of war, and indeed our conceptions of peace, are being disrupted at the moment by the narratives and the storytelling that's being done.
That's a great question. And I really like the work of William Merrin, who's a digital war scholar, and who talks about how the fog of war has become a cloud of war. So we really, in a way, we are seeing the reification of those traditional ways of portraying war, but at the same time, we're seeing a lot more. And so that really also thinking of Megan Mackenzie's work and Nicole Wegner's work, Feminist Solutions to Ending War, and thinking of perhaps unsettling those traditional metrics by which we view military violence. So when Mariupol was just beginning to be under siege, somehow the number of civilian casualties was very significant. And that is something that really made me very angry, because in wartime scenarios like this, it is extremely difficult to record civilian deaths. There are a lot of the victims were hidden under rubble. There was no way to get to them. And so at one point, there was a speculation of the figure of civilian casualties reaching over 20,000. And somehow, to seeing at people's online reactions to this figure, somehow that was significant. So 2,000 is not significant. 20,000 is somehow much more significant. And then people start translating in how many 9/11s it is, how many Srebrenicas. So that is unfortunately the way that we still, the very mainstream dominant way in which we still relate, oh, how many civilian casualties is it? How many civilian casualties is too many? But these figures do not really incorporate the slow violence that many people are experiencing, these everyday forms of violence that a lot of people are experiencing in their everyday. So there's a lot of digital media tools that are helping convey and witness those experiences. For example, there's a website where one can see how much time people in different cities in Ukraine spend with the shelter-in-place order. So it's just tracking sirens, and it's telling so that people in this city needed to take 8 hours out of their day to shelter in place. Then sometimes it happens during the night. We know with research, Jackie Orr's research, she's a sociologist, and she's looking at the impacts, the psychological impacts of these drills. And in the Ukrainian case, it's not a drill, it's really a real siren that's telling you to shelter in place. So there's a lot of this slow violence of hunger, of not being able to access critical medical care that we can witness through social media. And I guess to me, the most unexpected thing was when I tweeted about my grandmother who has dementia and who learns about the fact that Ukraine has been attacked by Russia every day anew. And really, these evacuation orders are really traumatic for her. And so this is happening day by day. So we can really look at kind of other ways of experiencing wars, relate to those. I didn't expect that it would resonate with so many people, but then people who understand what it's like, they somehow found it very significant. And so these are some of these stories we can see and we can perceive on social media, and they kind of help unsettle those very traditional metrics of military conflicts.
Yes, as you say, the traditional maps of troop movements, also maps of refugees fleeing west or the numbers of civilian casualties and so on, these are helpful up to a point in conceptualizing some of the impacts. But as you say, it's really interesting to see the kind of the more creative, the more innovative methods that are emerging, or the trends that are emerging to map, to scale, to visualize, to conceptualize the slow violence, as you put it, and the many, many hidden, unseen consequences and impacts of an ongoing conflict, which are often hidden from view in a short news bulletin. So you've touched on some examples of data visualization, for example, that might stretch or deepen how we understand and visualize the war in Ukraine and war more generally. What kinds of data visualization or network analysis might also help us think about conflict resolution and peace building? Have you got any thoughts on that?
So to me, data visualization in forms of networks allows us to experience data in a bit of a different way. What's really interesting about a network is that it's an epistemology, but it's pretty much unobserved. So as computational social scientists, we can construct a network based on different commonalities. So that is more to explore connections between individual data points rather than summarize it. And so when we were talking about those statistics, basically, of civilian deaths, of the territory that were captured, there's really interesting tallies at the end of each day, how many Russian tanks were destroyed, all these things. There are still very kind of traditional 20th century ways to summarize some of the military harms that are being done. And so compared to those, networks really allow to understand the significance of each particular element and really to link different occurrences of something together. And so we can identify coordinated behavior through networks. We can better understand how information travels through those tools rather than through traditional statistical tools. And we can just overall, we can explore similarities. And I'm just thinking that over in these newer military conflicts, network visualization and a lot of different means of collecting and visualizing digital data have really become the driving epistemology of how we understand the conflict or how we understand wars. We see a lot of collaborative mapping tools where one could map different instances of something and then make sense of them as a network. So for example, we can see Bellingcat's mapping tool where people cite and map different instances of different military maneuvers. They can map different instances of civilian deaths, other things, and then looking at them from the network standpoint really provides additional insights into what's happening. And so that's what I'm really interested in is how we can link those disparate elements to each other and yield new insights from what we're seeing. And so this whole idea of a network-centric warfare really is part of it. It can capture how we conceive of military conflicts in the digital age, but also this understanding of network as both a fabric or a structure of cords or wires or nodes that kind of are knotted and secured into this entity, but also as an informally interconnected group or association of persons. So there's so much wordplay even in what we understand of as network and what different kinds of networks can be generated.
I think one of the things that's emerging from the conversation we've been having is that it's not simply that different disparate aspects of conflict are becoming more visible, but the complexity and the interconnectedness, and as we've said, the hybridity of it, and that level of greater understanding and the sort of the democratization of knowledge as well that comes with far more people having access and insight and an ability through open source intelligence, through social media more generally, to see, to understand, and to put things together. All of that is leading to a deeper understanding, because it's a more complex understanding of how conflicts play out, what their impacts are, and that in turn might lead to more conflict prevention in future, or a deeper understanding of the tools and the mechanisms and the things that are required for conflict resolution going forward, and the fact that actually going from conflict to conflict resolution isn't a binary in itself. We're obviously living through deeply worrying times. The war in Ukraine has been our focus today, but of course there are many other conflicts also going on elsewhere, many people suffering from the effects of conflict, from forced displacement, starvation in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in many other parts of the world. And strategists and policy advisors have been alerting us to increasing risk of climate-related conflict in the future, alongside more threats from cyber and other forms of digital warfare. As an expert on both digital culture and collective humanitarian activism, how optimistic or pessimistic do you feel about the future?
I guess I feel both. If there's anything I have faith in is people's resilience and people's ability to organize in the face of different threats. I am not a techno solutionist. I do not appreciate those techno optimist discourses that as long as we design the right platform or the right technological approach, we're going to be fine. And we know that those approaches have backfired many times. And so a lot of the times it's kind of both sides of the coin. But what's really significant here is that those digital technologies, they're never just tools, because that's another kind of very mainstream understanding of technology. Well, it's just a tool that helps us. And that's kind of the understanding of technology that's been propagated by the Silicon Valley. A lot of the times it's just, so for example, I'll give you one example. There was, at the very beginning of war, there were two guys, I believe from Harvard University, who have created a platform where refugees could look and offer housing, which is an amazing piece of humanitarian tech. And it was lauded by many Western media. And it was actually, the way they did it, it was done very fast and it was really effective in helping coordinate these efforts. But also it's a perfect human trafficking tool. And so understanding that there's a lot of risks involved in using these technologies, but the fact that they also kind of unsettle some of the power relations, they afford certain kinds of action to happen. And a lot of it is positive, and a lot of it is used to further humanitarian goals. some of it can always be weaponized. And that's, I guess, that's my main philosophy when I have incorporated the studies of digital war into our digital cultures program. And so that is what I say in the very beginning of my lecture on digital war, is that there's two reasons why it's really significant to think about those things. One is that a lot of technologies have their military roots. So a lot of the technologies that we're using today, including the internet, were essentially designed by the military. We can see that going both ways. We can see that a lot of civilian technology is being incorporated into the military-industrial complex. So it's a kind of a relationship that goes both ways. But also a lot of technologies there is, right? So this highlights that there is always potential for weaponization of those different technologies. And so it's really interesting to think of contemporary wars as kind of this potentiality of things being weaponized, and just watching these processes unfold and understanding the risks involved. And so I guess that's something that we're particularly mindful of. So seeing how, for example, civilian witnessing is getting weaponized in this conflict, understanding that sighting of the enemy's military equipment is allowed, sighting of and witnessing your own country's military equipment is something that can land someone in jail these days. So even this distinction between this act of witnessing and just taking a photograph on your phone is not neutral, that it can be weaponized depending on who's doing it, right? So thinking about our positionality in this conflict and various kind of power structures that we're embedded in, there's going to be new weaponizations, there's going to be new weapons that are being involved and incorporated into the military-industrial complex. At the same time, there's going to be a lot of military tech that's going to be maybe used for the wider good. That's the way I see this process.
And that really draws attention to the importance and the value of research like yours, which raises awareness about all of this, raises awareness of the complexities, of the hybridities, the opportunities, but also the risks of the tools that are evolving all the time. If I may, I'd like to end, though, on this note of optimism, this faith in people's ability to organize and self-organize and resilience. And, without wanting to idealize over much, you've told a number of stories in the course of the conversation that really bear witness to the power of small groups of activists, very grassroots organizations, to defend, to fight back, but not simply in a short-term way, but to do so in ways that actually contribute to and help build important foundations for a nation's identity, a nation's shared sense of belonging and democratic values and democratic practices. So there's a lot of hope, I think, to take from some of this, as well as a lot of caution and awareness of the risks and the challenges. Olga, thank you so much for taking time to talk to me today. I will continue to think of your family and others living through the ongoing war in Ukraine. If listeners want to contribute from afar, what humanitarian organizations would you most recommend for donations?
Well, as someone in Australia, I would recommend the Ukraine Crisis Appeal, which is a network that is well established, that has really been able to provide a lot of humanitarian aid back to Ukraine and whose efforts are ongoing. This is a local network that's organized among Australian Ukrainians, and that I would really suggest to make a donation.
Thanks, Olga. And thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us. Keep an eye or an ear out for more episodes coming up. If you'd like to support our project, please also share and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use so you don't miss an episode. And please do leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcast. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like to follow our conversations, you can find us on social media, just search for Visualizing War, or you can get in touch directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafir Gertin. Thank you very much for listening.